Hi, welcome everybody. In this chapter, we're going to talk about control of an internal environment. And really, what we're focused on here is understanding a mechanism known as homeostasis and how we're going to utilize homeostasis and how this is affected by exercise. Again, kind of establishing what homeostasis is and how we can deviate from this safely during exercise in order to improve ourselves will kind of lay that foundational work for us as we kind of move forward in these different units and talk about the various organ systems and how we might modify them based on exercise training and also based on, one singular exercise. So let's get into it. All right, so what is homeostasis? Homeostasis is maintenance of a constant or normal internal environment. And essentially, we have like all these different things and processes going on in the body, and homeostasis is like this narrow range that we'd like to maintain a lot of physiological variables. Okay, that sounded like a bunch of fluff. So what does that mean? It means that your body likes to stay like within this narrow range, and it has all these checks and balances available so that we can kind of make sure that happens as we adjust to various changes from the external and internal environments. Okay. So here you can see homeostasis is very dynamic in nature. And in this particular graph, we can take a look at what's happening with time here on the bottom axis and mean arterial blood pressure shown here. And essentially what we're saying is that the body would like that blood pressure, that mean arterial pressure, which is like the average pressure that you have like in any given minute. We want it to be 93. And so you can see like as it increases above that, the body will activate these various mechanisms in order to shoot it down. And you can see now it's dropped a little bit lower. And so now we're going to activate some sort of mechanism that will allow it to creep back up. And the idea is we want to keep it between this very, very narrow range in order for us to maintain our normal functioning. Okay. We also have something known as steady state. And steady state is when a variable is unchanging but isn't necessarily within those normal resting values. Okay, so we use steady state a lot when we do like a moderate exercise bout, like an elliptical or like a nice moderate jog or run, something along those lines. Okay, so for example, maybe our normal resting heart rate is, let's say, 60, right? And I could go out and go do the elliptical or go for a run or do a bike ride or something along those lines and have my heart rate kind of just stay at a steady 140. Okay, so significantly higher than what I have at rest. However, I can kind of maintain that and that feels comfortable, and oxygen demand and oxygen supply are kind of equal and everything feels good, right? However, that kind of steady or moderate activity is considered a deviation from our normal resting values. And again, we would define that, like I mentioned, as steady state. So here we can see an example of that. So here you can see body core temperature during exercise. And again, our resting level for body core temp is around 37 degrees Celsius. We're going to see that kind of increase linearly when we get to 40 minutes, and then we're going to kind of reach that steady state level closer to 38 degrees. Now, again, that's not our normal resting level. However, that's a level that our body feels comfortable with during that prolonged exercise bout in order for us to kind of keep up with the demands of that exercise bout. Okay. So here we can take a look at the control systems of the body. We have intracellular controls. We also have organ systems. So again, let's take a look at some of these examples. within those intracellular control systems, again, how we think about how does homeostasis affect what's going on inside of the cells. We have protein breakdown and protein synthesis. And again, essentially what's happening is we have these like amino acids that are floating in this what's called an amino acid pool, and we can pull from that pool based on what we need. So for example, if I did a hard exercise bout and I need to rebuild some muscle, I can pull these amino acids from the pool in order to build those muscles. Okay, let's say I wasn't eating well, right? I wasn't eating well and I'm doing a lot of hard exercise, or I'm an adolescent and I'm growing and I need to be kind of building a lot of proteins, whether that be muscle mass or some of these other structures that might be growing and changing as we grow during adolescence. If I don't have those proteins within that amino acid pool, I can break down muscle in order to build other items that are needed. So again, we can think about protein, amino acids, and kind of how those are going to be kind of constantly changing, right? So we're going to kind of have this constant influx and change within those amino acid pool, and like I said, building and breaking down. Okay, we can also think about energy production as well. So again, our body constantly needs what's called ATP, and we'll learn about that in the next unit. But essentially, this ATP is our energy currency. We only have like a little bit. We have like $5 floating around. So we're constantly going to the ATM and going to these different bank accounts to pull out money so that we have this currency, right? So again, a very dynamic process in order for us to continue to have the energy that we need to do regular activity or to do exercise. Okay. And then also the maintenance of stored nutrients. So again, if we're breaking down a lot of energy, we're creating a lot of ATP because we're doing a lot of exercise or whatever it is. We also have to have our nutrition change, right? So again, if I'm breaking down a lot of things, I'm going to feel hungrier, right? So and I'm going to crave maybe it's the fatty or salty foods or whatever it is, so that I can get those nutrients to help maintain those stored values. Okay. When we think about organ systems and their control, again, we've got homeostasis working on this kind of supply demand. So again, within the pulmonary system, if I need more oxygen, I'm going to respond by increasing my respiration rate and the depth of my breathing. Same thing with the circulatory or the cardiovascular system. So again, if I need to deliver a lot of oxygen because I'm using more at the levels of the muscles, I'm going to increase my heart rate so that I can move that blood faster and get that oxygen delivered. Okay. So again, this will allow us to replenish oxygen and remove CO2 or remove our waste products in order for us to maintain homeostasis in those manners as well. Okay, so we think about biological control systems. We have several different systems to kind of talk about, but essentially we're looking at a series of interconnected components that maintain a physical or chemical parameter in that near constant value. So again, we talked a little bit about body temperature and how that is a variable that we'd like to control through homeostasis. And we've got several components here. So we have a sensor or a receptor. So for temperature, we have what are called thermoreceptors, and these thermoreceptors are located on like our skin surface, and they're also located in our core. So that would allow us to know, okay, what is our core temperature? What's the temperature of those those vital organs, and also what's the temperature at my skin surface. Okay, and so that's going to give us information from those different receptors. That's going to send that information up to the control center. The control center for this homeostatic system is within the hypothalamus of the brain, and so the brain's going to be receiving all this information, and it might say, wow, it's really hot, like we need to get you cooled down. Or they might say, wow, it's really cold on the skin, and so here's what we need to do to kind of maintain our temperature. As a result, that hypothalamus is then going to send out information to our effectors. And our effectors in this particular example will be either sweat glands or shivering muscles. So again, if it's really hot and we're feeling overheated and the temperature is too high, we are going to activate those sweat glands and help us to kind of cool down. If we feel really cold, right, and those information at that control center tells us that we're too cold, we're going to activate those shivering muscles, and that's going to allow us to produce more heat. So here we can kind of see that. So again, you can see we've got a control center here, we've got sensors, we've got effectors, and again, they're going to work in what's called a negative feedback loop. Okay, so here you can see that our stimulus for, if we're talking about temperature still, our stimulus, that it was too hot, it was too much. Okay, so the stimulus was heat. That sends a signal through that sensor, which was the thermoreceptor, to that control center, which was the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus then activates a response, and that response is going to be to start sweating. Okay, and as we start sweating, that's going to allow us to return that body temperature back to our normal homeostasis. Okay, and again, this is called negative feedback because essentially we see a change in one direction and that effector causes a change in the opposite direction. So it got too hot over here, so we saw an increase in temperature. And as a result, the effector is going to cause an opposite change. So that's going to cause our temperature, our sweating is going to cause us to decrease temperature. Okay, so that's what it means when we say a negative feedback. So when we think about negative feedback, again, I want to give you a couple different examples here to kind of take a look at this. So when we think about how this system works in terms of negative feedback, the response reverses the initial disturbance in homeostasis. So for example, if blood pressure increases, the response will decrease blood pressure. So again, it's going to allow us to kind of react to changes away from that set point. So some examples, like I said, blood pressure would be one example. Blood sugar is another example where, again, we want to keep those levels kind of within this really narrow range. And so we have both checks and balances on both ends. If blood sugar gets too high, we have one system that will kind of be called into effect. And if blood pressure gets too low, same thing. We have a reverse system that's going to allow us to increase that blood pressure. Body temperature, as we mentioned, is also another example. Again, most of our control systems work through this negative feedback loop, like I said. So again, if blood pressure gets too high, we have a response that's going to cause blood pressure to lower. Once we get back into that normal range, that system will shut off and will kind of stay at that, whatever that range was. So we also have something called positive feedback. And again, this is not very common when we think about how this impacts the physiological functioning of the system. And essentially what happens with positive feedback is the biological response increases the original stimulus. So for example, if this were true about blood pressure, which it's not, an increase in blood pressure would stimulate a greater increase in blood pressure. Okay, so again, very limited number of control systems work in this way. Labor contractions is one of the ways in which positive feedback is used in the body, one of the only ways. And so essentially when we release this hormone called oxytocin, that starts the labor contractions. And once that hormone is released, it causes a cascade of events, allowing an increase in the strength and frequency of those contractions until baby is born. So again, it's going to kind of build. So that's an example of positive feedback. Another example is blood clotting. So again, we're going to release a hormone that's going to cause those proteins to clot wherever the breakage point was within the wall of the vessel. And again, that's going to cause more clotting to occur once we have just a little bit. So again, those are just two examples, kind of two of the only examples that I could come up with that is true as it relates to positive feedback. So again, when in doubt, Just remember, negative feedback is going to be responsible for most of the kind of checks and balances and allowing us to be in that steady state within homeostasis within the systems of the body. So again, like I said, examples, labor contractions, and blood clotting. Okay, so we think about gaining the gain of a control system. This is the degree to which a control system can maintain homeostasis. So again, a system with a large gain is more capable of maintaining homeostasis than a system of low gain. So again, like we mentioned, we have tons of these different systems and set points within the body. Here we're taking a look at to what extent can we maintain that particular window that we've created, and how difficult or easy is it to kind of sway away from that set point. So the pulmonary and cardiovascular system have large gains. So they have a great capability of maintaining homeostasis. And again, that makes sense when we think about what their functions are, right? We need to deliver oxygen and nutrients to all the tissues of the body, including the brain. And we need to bring in oxygen and get rid of waste products. So again, those are really, really important systems. And there's not a lot of wiggle room in terms of them being able to do their job. And the other thing that's nice about those systems is there's lots of ways we can manipulate or change some of those factors. So again, when we think about this large gain, there's lots of different ways in which we can lower blood pressure if it gets too high, or whatever portion of the cardiovascular system we might be talking about. So again, we have lots of opportunities to kind of check that system and keep it kind of in line, based on the changes that occur. So some more examples of homeostasis and homeostatic control. So again, as we mentioned, regulation of body temperature. So how does this work? We've got these thermal receptors or thermoreceptors that are going to send a message to the temperature control center in the brain, which is the hypothalamus. And then we're going to have a response. If the temperature gets too hot, our response will be to send blood to the skin surface so that we can dissipate heat. That way we can also activate the sweat glands that are going to help us with temperature regulation as well. Okay, so this kind of shows you what that looks like. So here you can see, sorry, I'm kind of zooming in here so that I can read all this as well. So here you can see the temperature control system, which we said was in the was in the hypothalamus. And here you can see a change. Okay, so again, if I have body temperature above normal, it's going to activate those thermoreceptors through the sensors. They're going to send a signal to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to have an effect where it causes blood to be sent to the skin surface. That's why our faces get flushed when we exercise, because we're trying to get rid of heat. We'll also start to activate those sweat glands. As we have these effectors kind of doing their thing, that's going to cause us to decrease body temperature and get us back to that normal body temp. Okay, here you can see on this side what happens when body temp gets too low. So again, if body temp dips down, if it's cold out, that's going to cause activation of those thermoreceptors, and they're going to send a signal to that control center, and that's going to cause the effect of the blood vessels to constrict. It causes the sweat glands to become inactive, and that will allow us to return back to normal body temperature. So again, what's kind of interesting when we think about homeostasis as it relates to sport and exercise is that exercise is a planned deviation away from this set point. And so exercise disrupts homeostasis on various levels. So it will cause a change in pH, it causes a change in our oxygen concentration, our CO2 or our waste products, and also the temperature, right? So again, we said that body temp would increase, pH is actually going to decrease. We'll see an increase in waste products and a decrease in oxygen levels. And what's good about this is the more we train our bodies, the more comfortable we are with creating that deviation. And the more often we exercise, the more comfortable we become with those changes and with how far away I can get from that set point. That deviation will increase with training status. So again, we think about like elite athletes having a higher pain tolerance. Part of it has to do with this homeostatic control system and our ability to know that, hey, I'm used to doing this exercise. I'm going to go away from that homeostatic set point, but I'm going to get you back to normal eventually. So again, kind of creating a system where your body is used to that is an important part of our training to allow us to kind of be used to those deviations. So an intense exercise, prolonged exercise in a hot and humid environment can exceed our ability to maintain that steady state. So again, if I'm doing something super intense or doing something in kind of those extreme environmental conditions, that's going to cause me to say, hey, I can't keep up with the demands of this exercise. I need to slow down or I need to stop because I can't maintain body temperature within a range that I feel comfortable with. So certainly we can understand that because these systems are complex and because the checks and balances are, fairly integrated, it is possible that we have failure of these systems. And failure of the biological control system can result in disease. So again, we're thinking about this kind of gradual over time shift in kind of that homeostatic set point. And some examples of this include hypertension and type 2 diabetes. So hypertension is high blood pressure. And again, we said that we want to keep our blood pressure within this narrow range. And as we choose unhealthy behaviors and as we age, a lot of times that set point will kind of deviate up a little bit, resulting in hypertension or high blood pressure. Type 2 diabetes is another example here where we see kind of that sugar level or the blood glucose level kind of shifting up gradually over time as we choose kind of unhealthy foods and choose to not participate in physical activity or exercise. So again, those are just two examples of those systems kind of failing us. A lot of people would consider obesity to kind of fit in this range as well. So there is a lot of people that believe that obesity is kind of a result of this kind of shift in set point when we think about our body weight and our body composition. Certainly there's an optimal range for all of us. And, as we again choose things to kind of override that, such as unhealthy foods and a sedentary lifestyle, that's going to allow that body weight and body fat percentage to kind of creep up and get us out of that homeostatic set point into a kind of a higher, unhealthier range. So again, those are three examples: hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and potentially obesity. So when we think about being able to kind of adapt to our surroundings and adapt to some of those behavioral actions that we choose, two different terms that we want to kind of talk about are adaptation and acclimation. So adaptation, think about changes in the system to become more efficient. So again, this can occur over several generations. Think of this as like survival of the fittest and evolution. So again, when we think about adaptation, we're thinking about how can I make this system more efficient so that I can do this thing easier or survive for longer, essentially. So again, we can think about, for example, the cardiovascular system. If I do a lot of aerobic work, I'm going to improve the efficiency of that system so that system can do that work with greater ease. So again, all of these adaptations or all of these changes that we make are all ways for us to allow ourselves to live longer, essentially, or increase the likelihood of longer living. And when we think about, survival of the fittest and evolution, that's really what we're after. Now, there is very interesting evidence to take a look at adaptation kind of over generations as well. And so, as I mentioned, if I were doing a lot of cardiovascular work and kind of upregulating those systems, doing aerobic work, whatever, maybe I'm doing that kind of early in my life and then I get pregnant, it's very possible that I'm going to upregulate or express the genes that would favor that in my offspring or in my children. So again, a lot of interesting stuff there there when we take a look at what's happening from a genetic perspective and kind of how we're able to pass on those genes from a genetic perspective, but also we got to think about, what are we passing on from a behavioral perspective as well. So certainly all of those factors play a role. It's hard for us to really separate out genetics versus behavior, because not only do you get genetics from your parents, most likely if you're a biological child of your parents, you also get their behavioral habits as well. So again, we're learning both nature and nurture are going to play an important role in this. And when we think about adaptation, we're really interested in that physiological change to become more efficient to whatever stressors we've placed on ourselves or have placed on us. Okay, acclimation is a gradual, reversible change in the body of an organism to better suit the environment. Okay, so when we think about acclimation, this could be due to heat, it could be due to altitude, and again, this is, like I said, this is reversible. So I'm recording this lecture in July, and so when we think about acclimation to the heat, it's a lot easier for us to cope with heat in August and September than it is for us to cope with heat in April. If you live in Iowa or if you live in the Midwest, somewhere in that range, because we've had, an extended amount of time where we've been exposed to those stressors and our body's able to kind of adjust to that. So interestingly, we can acclimatize to the heat every season, every time summer comes around. And it takes about 10-ish days for us to start to get some of the benefits of heat acclimation. Now, when we think about altitude, again, same thing. If I were to go move to Colorado, I would be able to acclimatize to that altitude by several different physiological changes that can occur in my body. Now, let's say I went out there for college and I lived out there for 4 years. So I would acclimatize when I moved out there, but then if I moved back to Iowa, I would acclimatize back to the environment that I was experiencing here. So again, these changes, when we think about acclimatization, are not permanent. They're not stable. And so it's kind of one of those things where, I will adjust to the temperature or adjust to the altitude that I've been given, but then my body will always revert back to the lowest level that it has to in order to sustain comfortable life. So again, we're able to kind of see that modification, as we change our environments. Okay. So when we think about this, cell signaling plays an important role in allowing us to adapt and acclimatize. Okay, so cell signaling, we're going to have communication between the cells using chemical messengers. This is going to help us to coordinate cellular activities, and this is important for homeostasis. Again, these control systems or these communications between cells can be improved or modified based on the amount of stress and the types of stressors that we provide ourselves with on a regular basis. Okay, so here we can see exercise-induced hormesis. And hormesis, what does this mean? So hormesis is defined as a process to which a low to moderate dose of potentially harmful stress, such as a chemical agent or environmental stress, results in beneficial adaptation response on the cell or organ system. So exercise-induced hormesis defines much of what we know about exercise-induced adaptation to the body, right? So again, if we think about what we're doing in a single exercise bout, I don't want to say it's bad, right? But it seems bad to the body, right? I'm going to provide this level of pain. I'm going to create these waste products. I'm going to increase my body temperature. All those things are bad when we think about, the body's role in terms of maintaining homeostasis. However, when we do this in kind of these small doses and then allow ourselves to recover from this is when we're able to actually improve those systems. Okay, so again, when we think about exercise is kind of this planned deviation. Yes, it's bad that we're producing waste products and we're producing pain in our muscles and our body temperatures are getting really high. But as long as we give ourselves adequate time to recover following, this is what allows us to adapt to that stressor and allows these body systems and cells to become better in terms of efficiency and kind of dealing with these various elements that are going to be hard for us. So here we can take a look at, kind of what's going on from a research focus. So here you can see exercise-induced hormesis. here. And here you can see intensity and duration of exercise, and here we can see physiological function. Okay, so if I do too little exercise, it's going to have a negative effect on my body's function. And the reason for that is the body will revert back to whatever the minimum amount of work is that it has to do in order to stay alive, right? So if you never stress the body, it's going to revert back to kind of a lower functioning level because it's comfortable. It doesn't have to do anything hard. So again, your body wants to be as efficient as possible. So if you never challenge your body won't be prepared to handle any challenges. So that's what we see when we see too little exercise. Okay. When we go to optimal exercise intensity and duration or regular exercise, we can kind of maximize those physiological benefits. Now, interestingly, when we think about this, it's really more of a range, right? And again, think about the different athletes that you've had as a coach. You know, I've got athletes that can handle a ton of volume and a ton of workouts, and that's no problem. They're going to adapt and they're going to do great with that. I have others that you ask them to do, I'm a track coach. You ask them to do a 20-minute run and it's like, oh my gosh, they need to lay down after that. So what is optimal for each individual is going to vary, depending on a lot on genetics, on their age, on their readiness. So there's a lot of different factors that would create this larger range for that, in terms of what we need to do, in terms of kind of reaching those maximal benefits. And then on the other end is too much exercise. And if we do too much exercise, again, we're not allowing ourselves to kind of adapt and recover between those hard exercise bouts. And that will result in kind of some negative effects known as overtraining. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in this class for sure. Okay, so again, we talked about these cellular pathways or these signaling systems that's going to promote cellular adaptation during exercise training. And I want to just kind of show you the basics of kind of some of our options in terms of what that might look like. Okay, so we'll talk about cell signaling. All right, so here you can see cell signaling. Again, I got to zoom in so I can read what this says. This is pretty small for me. So here you have what's called an intracrine signal, and with intracrine, intra means within, and so an intracrine signal, we have a chemical messenger, and it's going to cause a change inside of that same cell. Okay, so again, I receive a stimulus, that's going to cause a chemical messenger to be released, and that'll cause a change within that individual cell. Okay. We also have juxtacrine, sometimes this juxtacrine you can see here. And essentially what happens here is when that change is induced or when that stressor is provided, a chemical messenger is released, and it's going to cause a change in an adjacent cell or a cell right next to it. Okay. And then with autocrine, so again, here you can see this chemical messenger is released. It exits the cell and is able to have an effect on that same cell. Okay, so the difference between autocrine and intracrine, with intracrine, everything is inside of the cell, nothing leaves the cell. With autocrine, I'm going to have a change of that same cell. However, I'm going to have the substance be released from the cell, and then it's going to kind of attach to the outside. So you can kind of see it binding to a receptor kind of on the edge, the outside edge of that cell here. And that's autocrine. Okay, paracrine is going to affect nearby cells. So with juxtacrine, it was the one next door. Maybe with paracrine, it's a few doors down. Okay, so again, here you can see the release of those chemical messengers, and they're going to have an effect on cells that are a couple doors down from them. And then when we think about endocrine, this is probably the greatest change that we see. And with the endocrine system, again, think hormones here. And essentially what happens is I'm going to release that hormone, it's going to glow in the bloodstream, and it's going to have an impact on all of these different cells that could be all over the body. Okay, so for example, when I release the hormone, thyroid hormone, okay, which is kind of in charge of metabolism, it's going to be released into the blood, and it's going to have an effect on all sorts of different places. It's going to have an effect on muscle cells, on the bone growth, on metabolism in the liver. So it's going to have a lot of different places that it's heading to kind of make an impact. So you can kind of see what's happening there with endocrine. Okay, so we think about stress proteins and how this assists in regulation of homeostasis. Again, we essentially, when we stress the body, we want to have change, right? That's kind of what we're after, is we want to be better than what we were the day before. So that's why we do training. That's why we do exercise. And so essentially what we're talking about here is when we stress the body or when we stress a muscle, for example, these proteins are going to assist in regulation of homeostasis. So again, let's say I do a hard lift, right? And I'm going to have a lot of breakdown within my muscles. And that's what causes me to be sore. But also the reason that we want to be sore is that's going to allow us to build those muscles up stronger after the fact, right? So during the recovery part of that exercise, that's where we really get to see those adaptations occurring. And essentially what we're saying here is that the challenge of the muscle results in upregulation of these protein producing pathways. And that's going to allow us to not only build back the muscle that we damaged during that exercise bout, but hopefully build it back stronger, more efficient, and potentially bigger, depending on what it is that I did during that exercise bout. So stress that induces stress proteins includes, like I said, resistance training work for sure, also aerobic work as well. Really any type of physical stressor that I can provide is going to allow me to kind of upregulate these protein pathways. So again, high intensity or prolonged exercise can promote each of these stressors. So here you can kind of see what we're talking about when we say exercise-induced protein synthesis. And again, protein synthesis is the production of proteins. And again, these could be new proteins or these could be just like the rebuilding of proteins that have been broken down here. Gosh, that's small for me to read here. So here you can kind of see what's happening from a DNA and RNA perspective. And again, the DNA and RNA that we see here is going to be impacted by some sort of autocrine or endocrine function, which will allow us to kind of upregulate the protein synthesis.